Hello, my name is John Thomas Dodson. Thank you for joining me for this presentation about the Bach Brandenburg Concerti. I'm looking forward to this to explore some of the music and the history behind the piece. Thank you very much for being here with me. Let's get started. So, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, and the subheading here, Hiding in Plain Sight, is a rather well-known part of this story for those who speak about these things, but if not, it's really quite a thing. We're so lucky that we have these concertos because there was really only one final copy of all of these put together. So Hiding in Plain Sight will make sense in time. The Brandenburg Concertos are in a genre called Concerto Grosso, which was sort of born and grew up in the courts of Italy, and it's primarily secular music. There is also Concerto Grosso that's sacred. They define those as sometimes the number of movements and the way they begin. But the place where this thing sort of grew into something that was recognizable is in Italy. And the Concerto Grosso style basically is built around this idea of opposition between big, everyone involved in the group, what we call the ripieno, and small, which is to say the individual parts, the concertato. And the individuals can be combined in different ways, and when they can be like a little conversation, or they can be individual voices that take place one after the other while they're accompanied by a small part of the surrounding group. So I thought that maybe what I would do first is just have us listen to a Concerto Grosso, a little part of one. This one is by Handel, and it's going to all be for just strings. The thing that you're listening for, if you're able to discern it, and I think you will be able to even on the internet, is that sometimes everybody will be playing and sometimes only solos will be playing. So you'll hear a full section of violins at times, and then other times just one violinist. Obviously, there will be accompaniment around that. Let's have a listen and see if you can do So that's the idea of it, right? Is big to small, shifting back concertos, normally for a single instrument, in this case, for different instruments that shift between individuals and the large group. And inside it, there's a structure, which I want you to notice. This is known as a ritornello. So if you look at this little piece of paper that I drew and you see the parts that are in sort of that butterscotch yellow, and think of it like you're reading from left to right. And as you read it, you would basically say, well, I see this sort of patchwork of yellow and then something else. And then I see more of the yellow and then something else different and then more of the yellow. And you might notice that I placed these at different heights, and all that really was to show you was that they're not always in the same key, just to say they play in different kind of altitudes. And that ritornello part, which is a cognate of return, it means that this music is going to come back over and over again. It's usually a tutti section, everybody, and you could think of it like it's a refrain. And what it provides in the music is unity. So the ritornello is part of the structure. Bach came to be familiar with this form or approach to music, and he liked it very much. There were other approaches at the time, but Bach really enjoyed this ritornello form. In between, there are episodes. So the episodes are often places for the soloists to appear, and they're kind of like these little conversational diversions that happen in between, and obviously they provide variety. So all of these places that you see that have kind of different quilts than the butterscotch yellow are these episodic things. When you put it all together, reading left to right, you have a whole movement, and you can see that it's got order to it, and that they might be in different keys, but usually at the beginning and the end, they're in the same key. Around that, there's very little more that you need to know, but one thing is basso continuo. So basso continuo is sort of the idea of music that has the bass line. It's a little bit like being in a jazz club. And then you would have chords coming, let's say, in the jazz club from the pianist. In this case, that would be the harpsichord. So often it's going to be the cello that will provide the bass line. It could be a different instrument, but in our case, often it'll be the cello. And then around it will be this sort of unusual looking keyboard instrument that looks kind of like a piano. There's a difference in the sound of the harpsichord from the piano. The piano, the sound is made by striking the string. So they call it a hammer that strikes the string, whereas there's a quill on the harpsichord and it actually plucks the string, which creates a different sound. So that gets us started here. We've got the basic picture of what's going on. And now I'd like to begin to tell this story about the Brandenburg Concertos. And I want to begin when Bach is just about to turn 18, and he's not even on the scene yet. We're going to go to Weimar. Bach is already an accomplished musician. He's a very fine organist, and he's a violinist. But before he gets to Weimar, the year before, one of the people on the staff there, his name is Johann Wilhelm Dresse, takes a trip, and he gets to go south from Germany down to Italy. And he studies for 8 months. And while he's there, he gathers up a bunch of music, which he brings back up because his father works there at the court in Weimar. And so what he's done is to go down, study the Italian style, and then return. And now he's back in Weimar. And when he does, it's 1702, and he's there for a while, flip over, and now it's sometime in the middle of 1703, and Bach shows up. And he shows up as a lackey, which is to say he actually is the lowest possible person on the totem pole. Not only is he a violinist, lackeys often had to do rather manual tasks around the court. So, you know, I don't know that Bach ever had to sweep a floor, but it would have been something that wouldn't have been highly dignified. So the lackey job was a temp job for him, and he was just there for about 5 months, but what a difference this made in his life, because he's introduced to Weimar and they're not going to forget him. And he meets someone. The reason you're looking at this house is this is a computer generated image where Bach would have lived. And so as you're looking at that house, one of the things I want you to notice is how close all these windows are. You can imagine the windows being open. You can imagine Bach being there and playing. And in the same building, this is the key, was a guy named Paul von Westhoff. He was a violinist, a very good one, and he was the composer of some solo partitas, little pieces for violin alone, in his case, violin with a little cello accompaniment. And he was an experimental kind of guy. He liked to experiment with the violin. So one of the things I read about him was that he was willing to introduce double stops, which is to say to play 2 strings at one time, going all the way up to the 4th position. Now, what does that mean? If you take your 4 fingers and you put them here on a violin, and now you said 1, 2, 3, 4, and where the 4th finger is, your pinky, you take your 1st finger and slide it up to that spot. Now you're playing higher. And when you do, it's more difficult to do. You have to change the location of your fingers to stay in tune. And that had not been done. It's Paul von Westhoff who adds this level of double stops up in this 4th position. I'm using it as a symbol because Westhoff was testing and trying out things with the violin, and he's living in the same house as Bach. So Bach gets a chance as a young man to learn from him and to explore ideas. And most probably he heard some music by von Westhoff from the solo partitas. I'm going to show you why I think that. I found 2 passages, one by Westhoff, the other by Bach. The one that's going to be by Bach is actually a little later in his lifetime. We'll talk about that. But he hasn't forgotten this. So here's this first music by Westhoff. Have a listen. It's from one of his partitas that is imitation, what he calls imitating bells. Have a listen. And the reason I wanted to show this music to you, the reason that I wanted you to be able to hear it, is because we have a tendency to think of Bach as being, I don't know, born in full, with all of his powers, almost at, you know, at the first appearance of Bach. And the reason is because his early music is already so good, and it's rather hard to see him as anything but a finished composer. But he's actually always a work in progress. He's always someone, I almost said a work in process. He's always someone who's looking and taking like a sponge what's around him and adding it into his language. And that language grows and grows, but there's always this central quality of Bach. I think you'll agree that when you hear this next passage, it really sounds like he's remembering Westhoff, even as he composes this truly amazing music himself. You'll notice there's no cello now in this music. Everything is done just by the violin alone. Bach is there. He learns from this great violinist, and then he leaves because he has a chance to get a job in Arnstadt. And his job is not as a violinist, but as an organist. And it works out well for him. He's there for a number of years. And Arnstadt will not be a big part of our story other than to say Bach continues, and he's already great as an organist. Frankly, he was hired there to check out the organ when he was 18 years old, which is pretty amazing because you had to be an expert to check it out. He was 18. He has then a one-year job at a place called Mühlhausen, which doesn't seem to be the happiest place for him. But one great thing happens there, which is that he marries his cousin, Maria Barbara Bach. And it's a very good marriage, a very happy marriage. And now in 1708, there's a job that opens in Weimar, and Bach is able to come back. They remember him. They know he's been an organist. That's why I wanted to begin this story earlier, because Weimar is really on a return trip, and they know who he is when he shows up. Now, I'm skipping in the story away from the place to just take note of something that happens, because it's going to be important in Weimar in just a minute. It's a couple of years later, and a piece is published, and that piece is called L'Estro Armonico, and it's published by a composer named Vivaldi. And what the piece is it's 12 concertos for 1, 2, and 4 combinations, 1, 2, or 4 solo violinists with string orchestra. Now stop and remember what I said at the very beginning, what a concerto grosso is, which is the idea of small forces against large forces. So sometimes when you have 2 violins, or certainly when you have 4, you've got something that very much approaches this genre that is the concerto grosso. It happens that when Bach was first hired, the first time in Weimar, he was hired by this guy, Prince Johann Ernst, who was a musician, a young musician, and a composer and a violinist. And he returns in 1713. And he brings with him a bunch of Italian music. And how do we know this? I wrote this down at the bottom because I thought you might find it interesting, that there still is a bill that exists in the documents from the castle there that says, you know, for copying, binding, and shelving music, there was a cost for that. And it comes right after the prince has returned from his trip to, he was from Utrecht at that time. So Bach is exposed to this new music. And the theory is that it's highly probable that the prince brought back with him the music of this L'Estro Armonico. And the reason that we think that is because they immediately mounted a performance of it there in Weimar. Remember, Bach is a violinist, a good one, and he's also a keyboard player. He was either playing the harpsichord or he would have been one of the violinists in the group. Let's listen for a little bit to this music, because Bach is going to love it so much he's going to do something with it. What is Bach going to do with it? Well, I told you his main instrument is organ. So Bach uses this as an opportunity, and he said, I'd like to transcribe it. Here is his transcription of that same music. And this allows Bach to get inside the music and really study it. This is one of the big things that happened while he's in Weimar, is not only is he studying generally music by several Italian composers, but specifically Vivaldi. And he's learning a lot about the way Vivaldi writes music and certain things that he does that are extremely successful. So Bach wants to incorporate those things into his own music. Let's listen to his version of that. So I played just one part of one concerto, but Bach actually did a whole collection of these. of Marcello and Vivaldi, and interestingly enough, of the Prince himself. And he does them primarily during this first year that the Prince is back. Unfortunately, the Prince has an early death, and so the relationship between Bach and the Prince is curtailed there. But you've now sort of seen that Bach is taking this in as he is there in Weimar. Part of his job after he becomes the Kapellmeister there is that he has the job of writing a cantata a month. So there are 30 cantatas that are there, violin sonatas, violin partitas, the well-tempered clavier, the little organ book. All of these are composed while he's in Weimar. But much more importantly, for our story, this is the first time he's sketching out what will become some of the Brandenburg Concertos. Not everything and not all of them in their final versions, but he's starting to work on them during this time. Change begins to come in Weimar. Bach has gotten himself up to the 3rd position. So he's come a long way from that first lackey job that he's got. And he's underneath a man named Samuel Dresse, and then Wilhelm Dresse, and then Bach. And what happens here is that Samuel dies, and Johann Wilhelm is the son, and Bach is here. And Bach sees this is a moment. At 1716, Bach's been there for a while. They know who he is. He's doing all this great work. He should get the job. And instead, they give it to the son. Bach is not happy. He knows who he is, and he knows that he should be getting that job. And so Bach is really upset at this time, and he starts to look for another opportunity. And he doesn't have to look far or long. He's immediately engaged by this man, Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Cöthen. And the prince over here is going to be one of Bach's, it's going to be the happiest time in his life in so many ways. And the prince installs him. You can see now a little bit inside. It was a nice place where he was going, and he's installed that same year in August, but he hasn't done one thing. He hasn't told his boss back in Weimar. And so he returns. This is his boss, rather interesting haircut there. And the boss is the Duke, Wilhelm Ernst. And he says, Bach basically says, look, you know, Samuel died and you hired the son Wilhelm, and I understand you've got your reasons, but for me, I would like now to move on where there are other opportunities. And so I have already been accepted for a new position. And the Duke is furious because he hasn't given permission. So this is actually, there are all kinds of problems here, including Bach's relationship with the Duke's nephews, I think it is, where they don't get along. And the Duke is like, got it out for Bach, and therefore he throws him in jail. Bach is arrested, and they say, you know, when you give up, this crazy idea of you going to the other place, you can come out of jail. The theory is that Bach actually asked for music paper and began the well-tempered clavier while in that jail in that month. And finally, they see that he is absolutely not going to give it up, and his resignation is accepted, and off goes Bach to Cöthen. So that's the end of the Weimar story, and this really wonderful time of learning and formulating the first versions of the concerti. But I said the first versions because there are new things afoot. Because in Berlin, in that same year, a new king comes into play. It's Friedrich Wilhelm I. He's known as the soldier king because what he cares about is to strengthen Prussia. And he cares not one whit about anything that isn't that particular agenda. And so for him, the first thing he wants to do is to marshal his resources towards military, and that means cutting the budget for the arts. So the Berlin court is immediately disbanded, and this creates a tremendous opportunity. It's difficult for the Berlin court musicians, but 7 of them are hired by the court in Cöthen. Remember this year, this is the year of Bach arriving there. So suddenly the orchestra in Cöthen that Bach is showing up for has just gotten a lot better. So Bach is now finally in Cöthen. He's living in this place. And there's some good news with this. Prince Leopold is a Calvinist, and that means that Bach won't be writing sacred music. For us, this means that he's going to have a lot of opportunities to write secular music, which will actually be of value for us as we explore these Brandenburgs. So here's Bach. This is what they think is an early portrait of him. And one of the things that happens, since he's going to write a lot of secular music, is that this is the time where one of the people writing say there's a complete embrace of dance music. I said that Bach is like a sponge and that he takes everything that he possibly can and integrates it into his language. So this dance music will show up even much later when he's writing his cantatas in Leipzig, sacred music that will have these dance forms in them. So Bach also begins to develop what some things had begun in Weimar that will become these Brandenburg concertos. They're not so named yet. We'll see why in a while. But anyway, these pieces, which are probably being played there at the court in Cöthen. That is surely the guess that we have. And I think you'll see why as we begin to explore this further. There are all kinds of clues in the music for this. So Bach is so good on the keyboard that the prince, who likes him a lot, they're really good friends. The prince says, you know, what we need is a really good instrument for you. So they commission a harpsichord from Berlin, not so far away, and Bach goes 1719. So it takes a little while to do this, but it's 2 years later, and he goes to pick up the harpsichord and to pay for it. And he decides along the way that what he wants to do is to also arrange for a performance for an aristocrat there, whose name is Christian Ludwig, who is himself a lover of music. And Christian Ludwig, I wrote down an alternate way of reading his name, which you'll see in a little while, because this name is going to be important to our story about the Brandenburgs. So Bach goes and he visits, and it's a wonderful evening. Bach plays for him, and he's well received, and now he comes back to Cöthen with the harpsichord. So the following year, early in that year, the prince, I think in March, invites Bach to join him as he takes a little vacation. He's going to go to Karlsbad. And this is a very sad part of the story. You remember that I told you Bach married Maria Barbara Bach. And when he goes to Karlsbad, he has no idea that she's about to get sick. So when he returns from this little jaunt, he finds that she's already dead. And this just is heartbreaking to him. This is a complete breakdown. They had a wonderful, wonderful marriage. And I can't tell you this, up to this point, Cöthen has been absolute bliss for him. But now everything that he sees there in Cöthen is simply a reminder of his wife. And he wants to leave. He actually begins to find a way out. He's got 4 kids at the time that he's going to have to raise. He has no wife, and he's overwhelmed, and he wants out. So actually, later that same year, he makes a trip to Hamburg to apply for a possible organist position in one of the churches. It doesn't come to anything, but Bach is really committed to getting away from this place where he has all of these memories. And so that's going to lead us to the why of this story, at least as far as I can see it, because the timing of this is just too coincidental. I think the Brandenburgs are actually Bach's way out of this terrible emotional pain. And so he remembers the Margrave, and he remembers what the Margrave had said, which you'll be seeing in just a minute, as Bach left his palace. And so this becomes a job application for a possible appointment to Berlin. There is no job, but Bach is hoping that he maybe can get one with this manuscript. So Bach sends off a manuscript. And the wonderful thing about it is we have the date, which is March 24. And interestingly enough, that's about a year after Bach had left for the trip to Karlsbad. So we have Bach having been mourned, his wife, and now he's sending this off as a way maybe of getting away. We can look inside the manuscript, and one of the things that you'll notice is, well, wait a minute, Bach is German, but he's writing this in French. Why? Because all of the courts have this tradition at that point of having the French language be the primary language of the court. So even if you had gone to St. Petersburg in Russia, interestingly enough, you would have found the court there speaking in French. And Bach has dedicated it to his sort of schoolboy French version of Christian Ludwig, which is Chrétien d'Huy. And that is the beginning. And even when he signs his name, he's signing it, as you can see, in the French version of Johann Sebastian Bach. And he says on the cover of this thing, for several instruments. I can't emphasize how understated that is. There's going to be a whole collection of instruments. The first piece I played for you, which was this Concerto Grosso, was just for strings. But Bach is going to introduce in each concerto a different combination of instruments that will produce just a galaxy of sound from these 6 concertos. Each concerto will have a completely unique sound world, and that sound world is a direct result of the choice of instruments that he's making. But where did those instruments come from? From the Cöthen court itself. So this, for several instruments, is Bach using this music that he's been creating for his prince and now putting it together during this time of mourning so that he can send it off to this man. And what happens? It's unopened. We don't know why. All we know is that it's unopened. So that dedication and that music and that score were never seen by Christian Ludwig. And so Bach sends it in 1721 and receives no response. 1734, the prince dies. He has no heir. That piece has been sitting on a shelf, and that shelf is part of his library. So what's going to happen is sort of this big, huge library sale. It's not going to be the kind of thing like a yard sale, but there's going to be a sale of his collection. And people who are in the know are going to know that they can go there and find some great things that they want as part of their collection. Remember, he was a lover of music, so there are people there who will certainly be looking for music. And one of them is this person, Princess Anna Amalia. And we can see that this is going to be her name that's actually imprinted on the Brandenburgs, on the cover, because she's the one who buys it. And she buys it for about $30. Who is she? She's the daughter of that soldier king. And therefore, she's the sister of the next king coming, which is Frederick the Great. And very important for us, she's the student of Johann Kirnberger. Not a name we know yet, but Kirnberger is going to be very important to our story. He is going to be the centerpiece of this whole thing. And his name, this is so important that he even signs his name on the cover of the manuscript. He's a student of Johann Sebastian Bach. And I don't know if Bach would have told him, I don't know that yes, once I sent or not, and nothing happened. But anyway, Kirnberger knows to tell her, go and look, see what you find, and she does. How do we know this story? Because when you turn the page of the manuscript, inside, what we find is a dedication to the Margrave. And as we look at that dedication, he tells us the story. Bach tells us, I had the good fortune a few years ago to be heard. And you commanded me as I went to send some pieces to you. And now I'm doing that, begging you to judge them not too harshly. Bach's being very complimentary here, hoping that he can compliment the aristocrat, maybe get himself a job. So that's the dedication. I want you to take a moment to just look at the writing on the Brandenburg score. And please take a note just how careful and meticulous this is. This is a score created to impress the aristocrat. It's Bach writing in the calmest way possible. Bach had a fantastic hand, but when you look at his writing, many times it looks like he's going incredibly fast in the writing. When you look at this manuscript, it's meticulous. And it's a gift, it's a fair copy gift. So when I see this, actually, I'm rather heartbroken by it because I know Bach is in mourning. And this is after probably he's come back from Hamburg and didn't get the church job. And now he's writing this thing out in the set of months following until he arrives at March and he sends it off. What's this music like? I said that it's a universe of sound, and I wanted to focus on the instruments of the music for a moment. So the first thing is there always is going to be that background group of the instruments of the strings. They can provide the unity of sound as background. And then many times with each of these concertos, Bach will put colors on top of them. So as an example, here are some hunting horns, and the horns can be played one of two ways. This is one of the ways. The other way is to turn them around where the bells are actually going out towards the audience. I love that way. And also he has put an oboe, 3 of them, and a bassoon, and what's called a violin piccolo, which is a little violin. It's actually tuned a third higher than the normal violin, so it has a very bright sound. And I wanted to show these instruments to you. If you look carefully at the oboe and the bassoon, and even the horns, you'll notice the horns don't have vowels. The bassoonist doesn't have the keys, neither does the oboe, really. And this archaic violin. Well, these are the way the instruments looked in the time of Bach. And so the first concerto is a collection of all these instruments together. And I thought we might hear just a little bit of this music. What you might notice when the music begins is Bach will introduce each of the parts of his orchestra. So you'll hear the horns and you'll hear the oboes do things and you'll hear the violin basically as a way of introducing during that first, now it's a word you know, the ritornello. So let's have a listen. I want to go through each of the concertos and see how Bach is assembling the totality of the instruments of the time. So you might notice as you look at this that I'm enlarging some instruments, but I'm keeping instruments that you've already heard as they begin to add up when you see the whole of the Brandenburg Concerti. So one of the things that we see here is on top, we have a trumpet. This is a trumpet of the period. And you can see, or a representative of the trumpets of the period, and it doesn't have the vowels you might be used to. These are what the flutes are like. They were recorders that he's using for the Brandenburg II. They're different sizes. The larger one would be lower. The smallest one is high. You're already familiar with this oboe. And now the solo violin is a regular violin that you're used to, although a Baroque version of that had a little bit of difference in the length of the fingerboards. But let's have a listen now. I think that you'll hear the sound is a completely different sound. Listen to the second Brandenburg with this high trumpet and this debate that takes place between all of these high instruments. Let's go on to the third Brandenburg. How is it different? One of the things that you notice right away is that it's only strings. So Bach has joined the strings together as one kind of color. And he's done it really in a wonderful way to give himself a challenge, because if all of the other concertos have these color instruments and suddenly you remove that, how do you create color when all of the instruments are of the same family? So Bach has 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 celli. He's got a contrabass and the continuo part, which is to say the harpsichord, playing the chords in the background. And what he does is to transfer the music so that sometimes violin 1 has it, then to violin 2, then to violin 3. And it's hard to hear that sometimes. You might hear little discrepancies in the color, but when you see the performance, which they would have had, of course, there was no such thing as a recording to listen to. You would have actually watched this music moving around inside the section of strings. It's an amazing thing to see the Brandenburg Third performed live. So let's have a listen to some of this music. I'm playing from the third movement of it. And what happens in the fourth Brandenburg? Bach reintroduces in the fourth color instruments, this time the solo violin and the strings in the background and flutes. So he writes actually echo flutes. No one knows quite what that means, although there's a passage where they are responsive to what happens in the violin. And so maybe it's just a phrase, but there's no such thing that we know about as an echo flute, but it's something he writes. And here the 2 flutes are usually played as recorders if they're playing from original instruments. And this music is amazing. The role of the violin in this is a true virtuoso role, whereas the role of the flutes throughout is often this pastoral quality. The 2 of those things working against each other or in combination is quite something to hear. Let's have a little bit of a listen. Try to remember that Bach has been hearing these great violinists as a young man, and as he's assembling this music, he's really learned the instrument. It's an amazing way to write for it virtuosically. that gives us just some feeling for that amazing fourth concerto. Takes us to the fifth concerto. Fifth concerto is extraordinary in so many ways. It's just a few players. If you look, violino, which is one violin, and then a viola, a single cello, double bass. This now a new word, concertato for under the cembalo, and then a violin principal and flute traverso. Let's look at this. So this is the flute that you might be used to seeing instead of the ways that the recorders which would have been played, which was down this way. And then the violin, the regular one, the one you're used to, not the little piccola. And then also this harpsichord. And then we've got the little collection of strings around it. I'm going to play two passages for you. The first is just the opening of the concerto. And again, very much like the first and the second, he introduces. So he sort of has you say, these are the different solo instruments that are going to be here in the piece. Beautiful music. And then I'm going to play one other passage for you. To go down to a later part of the piece. This is an amazing moment that takes place in the first movement. And what happens is that all the players are joining in, and suddenly the music begins to thin out. It's not getting slower, but softer. And one by one, players are playing softer and then dropping out until what we're left with is this instrument that is the least expected instrument that should be playing right then, because it should be one of the solo instruments of the time, the flute or the violin, with maybe the cello accompanying and the harpsichord filling in some chords. But instead, the harpsichord, the lowly harpsichord that's been sitting in the back, filling in the chords, turns into a solo instrument. The reason I love the passage so much is it gives us some sense of what it must have been like to hear the monster keyboard player, Johann Sebastian Bach, because his technique was so legendary throughout the area that he lived, that sometimes they would set up competitions, and when people would hear him, they simply wouldn't show up. They wouldn't show up to even be heard next to him. And we can hear that level of technique, which was simply unparalleled. It was legendary when we listen to this little passage from the Fifth Brandenburg. So let me play this music. You'll hear the music playing with everyone, and then gradually just the keyboard is the one left. And I think you might hear something, if you could, with any imagination at all, you can imagine what it must have been like to hear Bach. so we can kind of imagine Bach as a phenomenal keyboard player. This next concerto shows him in a very different light, because I can't imagine that Bach was actually playing this cembalo part. Much more probably, he's playing one of these viola parts. So let's try to explain what's going on here. The sixth Brandenburg is for some archaic instruments. These are instruments that were active during the time of the late Middle Ages Renaissance period. And you can see the shaping of them are quite a bit different than the modern violin. That actually is sort of in the range, not quite, but sort of in the range of the cello, but it looks like the shape of what you might expect to see with a double bass, because the double bass is from this family of instruments. And so the viola da braccia and the viola da gamba. So the viola da braccio is played as a shoulder instrument, and then da gamba is played between the legs, held like a cello. And then normally the gamba would be getting the busy part, and the viola would be getting the rather simple part. Here it's reversed. If you look at the music, you can see it, that the viola will get the hard work and the gamba will get the simple part. Why? Because the instrument of the prince was the gamba, and highly probable that this music was done where the prince could sit in and play. So Bach has very kindly given him very simple music so that he can be part of the band. And then Bach himself has taken one of the virtuoso passages. If you look at the music before I do the excerpt, you can see something, which is that the music is written in what's called close canon. So you can imagine music that's happening this way, and right behind it, the exact same music that's just right behind it. Normally, if you did a canon, you could think of row, row, row your boat as a round, row, row, row your boat simply down the street, and then somebody comes in later. Well, imagine doing row, row, and right away somebody else starts row, row in the middle of your, before you get to boat. That's what's happening in this music, so that the canon is what's called really close, and it's canon at the unison. Not easy to write, and Bach has done a great job of it, no surprise to that. Let's listen to the first part of this. And because the sixth has become my favorite, I think, of all the Brandenburgs, I'm giving myself a little bit of extra moment here. This is a moment from the second movement of the sixth. It's simply exquisite music, and I would hate for you not to have heard it in your lifetime. And I'm hopeful that right now what I'm doing is sort of acting like a matchmaker and saying, you know, he's really quite, or she's quite a really good match for you, and you should really go out and think about establishing a relationship with these Brandenburg Concertos. So have a listen to this amazing music from the second movement. exquisite music. And so we've heard a little bit of all of the Brandenburgs, and that could be the end of the story, but I would like to tell you a little bit more. First of all, I want you to notice on the screen before I leave it, how many instruments now are there. This is all the instruments that you just heard. If you look, you can identify every one of them and maybe even associate them with the different concertos. What's interesting is this is, of course, exactly also precisely the instruments that were in the Cöthen court orchestra. So Bach has actually created the Brandenburg Concerti while he's in Cöthen. They're the music that was being played there. And then because of the circumstances, he ends up sending off that manuscript unopened. And lucky for us, someone bought it. It wasn't lost along the way, as so much of his music was. And you and I have been able to enjoy that music. Let's pursue this story a little bit further. What happens to Bach? Well, I told you that was 1721. So just 2 years later, he moves and he goes to Leipzig. He is the, quote, third choice of the church. He's in charge of 5 churches, one of which is St. Thomas. He writes great pieces there, St. Matthew, St. John, the cantatas, amazing set of cantata sets, just unbelievable. Mass in B minor, all these other things. And finally, he dies in 1750. I'm leaving a lot of things out, that goes without saying, but we're pursuing the particular line of the Brandenburgs. That's what this is about. So I want to move forward with our story because I want to lead to this next person. How is it that we're even talking about Bach and the Brandenburgs? And it actually comes partly because of this guy, Carl Friedrich Zelter, who is known as the teacher of Mendelssohn. And what may not be known about him quite as much is that he was a pupil of Kirnberger. You remember Kirnberger as the guy who signed his name and who helped advise and taught Anna Amalia. And so it happens that Zelter actually copied out individual parts for the Brandenburg Five, probably had them played, maybe played in somebody's living room. And so whatever that private reading is, that music was already beginning to circulate through copies. Not all of it, but some of it. And Brandenburg Five was the one that if you had a really good keyboard player, you could do. You just needed a flute, a few other strings, and your keyboard player, and it could be played on piano. So I want you to follow the lineage here. Bach, and then teaching Kirnberger, Kirnberger teaching Anna Amalia and Zelter. What does Zelter do? He teaches Mendelssohn. And this is where the story has an interesting aside, which I wanted to share with you because I didn't know this story until I began to research it, that there's a whole other side, a family around this guy, Daniel Itzig. And he was a finance minister to Frederick the Great. You remember Frederick the Great, he's the son of the soldier king and he's the brother of Anna Amalia. And it happens that Daniel Itzig, his finance minister, loves Bach's music. And he hires one of Bach's children, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, to teach 2 of his daughters. And then he hires Kirnberger to teach the daughter Bella. And this will be important in a minute, so just hang with me. The Itzig family sisters are this kind of unknown story in music, but without them, I'm not so sure we have Bach. That is part of our conversation, because Sarah was a music collector and she collects the Bach family archives. And she's not the only one involved. She's got a sister named Fanny, and Fanny moves to Vienna, and where she actually establishes a house. She makes a living by taking in lodgers. And in her house, she has and knows this music because she's grown up around it. And she sets up these salons in her living room. And in those salons, she's playing the music of Bach and Handel. And in the 1780s, she had a lodger whose name was Mozart. So Mozart is staying in her home and listening in the living room to this music from her salons. So you can imagine this music is dispersing out. I'm not saying that's the only way Mozart by any means, because it isn't, that Mozart knows about it, but he's certainly listening to this Baroque music that isn't part of the regular repertoire of the concert halls at the time. He's hearing it in her place. Then another Itzig sister, Bella, who was the student of Kirnberger, she becomes mother. She has a daughter, Leah, and Leah is the mother to Felix Mendelssohn. This is going to be important because of first of all, Mendelssohn is just this Mozartian genius who comes along the way. But the particular family to which he is born, it'll be very important to us in relation to Bach, because in 1805, Leah and her husband, Abraham Mendelssohn, purchase over 100 manuscripts of Bach. This is the last collection of Bach. It's in an estate, and they buy them. They bring them to the Berlin Singakademie, and they give them to them. And so here is Mr. and Mrs. Mendelssohn and their collection of manuscripts of Bach. Remember, Bach isn't really well known at this point, but they buy it. Felix joins this academy where the family, by the way, is singing, and Zelter, the one that you heard about, who's the student of Kirnberger, he is the founder of this. And strangely enough, he starts to introduce this piece that they found in these manuscripts, which is the St. Matthew Passion. So they start reading sections of them under Zelter, and little 10-year-old Felix is in there singing. Along with him is Bela, his grandmother, and she sees what Mendelssohn is going to be, and she decides to copy out, have the copy, a score copied out for him, and gives it to him on his birthday. So Mendelssohn is the recipient from his grandmother of the St. Matthew Passion. And 5 years later, he performs it. That is considered the explosive moment for Bach, because this is when the larger public begins to hear about and understand in some kind of way, even in a very infantile way, the magnitude of who Bach was. So this Itzig family is central to our story because they're collecting the music, giving the music to the right place, having a son who later conducts the music, and it allows this music to explode. What happens from then? From 1749, there's a decision made in between to publish all of Bach's works. They gather them up, they have them, they begin to publish these, and piece by piece, Bach is coming out in the general public. 100 years after Bach's death, in 1850, the Brandenburgs are published. And then 1869, in this complete works of Bach, the Brandenburgs are published in the 17th volume. That's 147 years after the manuscript was sent. And now there's a secondary thing that happens, which is that Bach, because of this thing that happened in Weimar, ends up influencing the whole story of Vivaldi. And I wanted you to know this, that in the 1890s, there's this sort of beginning of interest in Vivaldi's music. And partly it's driven by this little place that I've circled here. Do you remember the piece that I played for you by Bach that was a transcription of the double violin concerto of Vivaldi from L'Estro Armonico? Well, I didn't show you this part. I intentionally took it out. If you look there, what it says is by W.F. Bach, copied by my father. And so what is happening is that Wilhelm Friedemann Bach is basically claiming to have done this transcription, which it isn't. And in the 20th century, that claim is debunked, and the piece is attributed, as it actually was, to Johann Sebastian Bach. But the side effect of that is that people had to research, well, tell me more about Vivaldi, because Vivaldi was largely forgotten by that time. So it's very interesting, the twist that happens. The Brandenburgs don't really enter the repertoire, though, until recordings. And there are sets of recordings, few individual Brandenburgs that are recorded, but complete sets begin with Corot and with Busch. The Busch are amazing in 1935, but they're all, of course, played in this old style. Finally, in 1964, Harnoncourt does the original instrumentation. You can actually begin to hear the colors the way they would have been. And performance practice is growing and growing. So in the 80s, the Hogwood and Pinnock become very important so that people can hear them. Not saying there aren't others after or during and all of that that are not interesting, but these are seminal moments in the dispersion of the Brandenburg Concertos to the general public. And then one final part of this story, which was really fun to me. You remember Bach had to go to jail in Weimar, right? Well, finally in 2008, they decide to make that right. So they annul what took place. And here's the story. There's this rehabilitation certificate, which is signed by Prince Michael of Saxony, Weimar, Eisenach. And he is the direct descendant of the Duke who originally jailed Bach. So remember, this is 2008 now. And that certificate was witnessed by Prince Edward von Anhalt, who is the direct descendant of Prince Leopold, who is the one who ended up taking Bach. So the two ducal houses now are reconciled, and here they are at the signing ceremony, one of them witnessing for the other, and that's the end of that story. Bach has been rehabilitated. I want you to remember something to understand the context of how all of this came about, because I want to give a shout out to the Handel-Haydn Society. The Bach Brandenburg Concertos were sent to the Margrave in 1721. And 1722, there was a church that was built, an iglesia. And this iglesia that you're looking at that's the facade of the Hinangelorum, which is this really beautiful church in the colonial city. And it's where we ended up performing these Brandenburgs. So the Concertos de la Villa hosted the Handel-Haydn Society of Boston to come and on original instruments, or the period instruments, I should say, and with performance practice to play all six over 2 nights. It was absolutely something that was unforgettable for all of us. Here they are looking at that. That looks like it's the 4th Brandenburg. And it was just a wonderful thing, and we were just delighted to be able to host them and have them perform. If you would like to hear that and see it, you can go to their website, handelandhaydn.org, and then there's a /HH for Handel-Haydn, -listening-room, and you can listen to that. If you have trouble remembering that or don't want to write it down, just go to handelandhaydn.org and go to their listening room, and midway down the page, you'll find it. You can see their complete set of Brandenburgs. And I wanted you to know that those are there.